Hello, and welcome tonight. You do not need to solve anything, remember anything, or hold yourself upright against the day. You only need to follow a river backward, farther than roads, farther than walls, farther even than the name of Rome. We are going to drift toward a landscape that existed before marble, before standards and banners, before generals and laws and crowded forums. It is an older world, slower and softer, shaped by hill shadow, birdsong, damp earth and water moving under evening light. If you can, let your thoughts loosen a little now. Imagine the last glow of sunset spread across gentle Italian hills. The upper grass still holds a little warmth, while the lower valleys have already begun to fill with blue shadow. Below them, patient and silver in the deepening dusk, the Tiber turns through the land without hurry. Nothing rushes on its banks, nothing asks to be finished tonight. Even the air seems to have lowered its voice. This is where the story begins, though not yet with kings or twins or cities. It begins with quiet. It begins with a place that does not know what it will become. The hills do not yet carry famous names. The river does not yet pass beneath bridges. No one standing in this twilight could guess that one day the memory of this landscape would travel through centuries and return again and again in the minds of those who wondered how greatness begins. But perhaps greatness, at its truest, never begins with noise. Perhaps it begins the way evening begins, so gently that the world hardly notices the change. A little less light, a little more stillness, a small promise taking shape inside the dark. So let the promise remain far away for now. Let it hover like a star you do not need to name. Let these first moments belong only to the hills, the river, and the soft weight of night coming down over ancient ground. Somewhere in that gathering calm, as the reeds lean and recover at the river's edge, a future city is sleeping in forms too small to see. It sleeps in a cradle, not yet made, in two children not yet born, in a mother not yet weeping, in a shepherd not yet aware that his life will brush against legend. The whole story is here already, but folded shut like a seed beneath the soil. And because it is still folded, because it is still hidden, it can be entered gently, without strain, without fear, as though we were only stepping farther into evening. Before we follow that hidden seed, allow the day to move a little farther away from you. You do not need to force your thoughts into silence. Let them go the way light goes from a field at dusk. Slowly, naturally, with no sharp edge where brightness ends and darkness begins. If some part of your mind is still busy, let it be busy in the distance. It can wander behind you while you rest here. Take one slow breath in, and then let it leave just as slowly. Feel the small quiet that follows, then another breath, and another. With each one, imagine the space around you becoming wider and softer. Your forehead loosens, your jaw unclenches, the back of your neck settles. Your shoulders, which have carried enough already, begin to sink into whatever is holding them. There is no task hidden inside this story. You do not have to pay perfect attention. You do not have to remember every name. You are allowed to drift. You are allowed to miss a sentence and simply rejoin the next one, like a leaf touching the current and floating on. And if the world from earlier today tries to return, let it return only as a faint sound from another room. Here there are no messages, no clocks to obey, no lists waiting at the edge of the bed. There is only an old river, an older sky, and a voice willing to carry the weight of sequence for a while, so that you do not have to. Rest has already begun. Sleep is not a door you must break through. It is something more like a shore, arriving under the feet of a traveler who kept walking softly in the dark. So for these next moments, let yourself be unimportant in the most peaceful way. Let your plans become mist. Let your effort grow thin and transparent. You are not falling behind anything by resting. In that warmth, the path back to the Tiber opens again. Picture now a quiet place beside the river. The bank is low and grassy here. with reeds gathered near the shallows and stones rounded smooth by years of patient water. The day's last warmth still lingers in the earth, but coolness has begun to collect above the surface of the stream. Somewhere a bird gives one final call before settling for the night. Somewhere farther off, hidden among darkening trees, an animal passes through dry grass and leaves only a small sound behind. You are safe here. That matters, because stories sometimes move through danger on their way to meaning. This one will pass through fear, exile, loss, and the sharpness of human ambition. But each time it does, we will remember the river, we will return to the reeds, we will feel the untroubled current continue on, indifferent to panic, faithful to its own calm direction. The Tiber in this early age is not yet crowded by barges, temples, steps, and voices. It belongs to moonlight, weather, fish, wild roots, and the occasional footfall of shepherds crossing home. It keeps secrets well. It receives what the land gives it and carries that gift onward without complaint. Think of this place as the story's first shelter, long before walls are built, before laws are spoken, before men argue about where a city should stand. Safety takes this form: soft ground, dark water, breathing space, a margin between one thing and the next, a place where something fragile might survive the night. Remember it: the smell of wet earth, the faint brushing of reeds, the low silver track of the river in the dusk. We will come back here again and again whenever the story has spent too much energy and needs to become simple once more. For now, let the riverbank grow larger around you until it seems able to hold not just your own tired thoughts, but the whole old world we are about to enter. Let it hold the hills. Let it hold the unborn city. Let it hold the names that have not been spoken yet. The water does not resist any of it. It only flows, and in flowing, makes room. Long before anyone called this place Rome, the land itself carried the whole shape of possibility in silence. Morning came softly across Latium. First, the higher ridges received a pale wash of light, then the lower slopes, then the narrow tracks where dew clung to grass and small stones. Thin mists rose from the water meadows and slowly untied themselves from the earth. Oak and fig stood in patient clumps across the hills, their leaves dark where the sun had not yet reached them. In the folds of the ground, narrow streams found one another and moved toward the Tiber in lines so old that no one alive could remember when they had begun. The people who lived among these hills were not thinking about empire. They were thinking about weather, lambing seasons, grain, storage jars, the strength of roofs, the health of goats, the nearness of rain. Smoke from small morning fires climbed into the cool air from humble dwellings of clay, wood, and straw. Hands moved through familiar work without performance. Water was fetched, animals were counted, grain was ground, children followed older footsteps, because that was how the shape of a life was learned. And yet, for all its modesty, this world was not empty. It was filled with careful meanings. A hill was not only a hill, but a place from which one watched the sky. A spring was not only a spring, but a gift that asked for gratitude. A tree was not only a tree, but a keeper of shade, memory, and quiet signs. The people of Latium lived close enough to land and season that they seldom imagined themselves separate from them. Storms were not inconveniences, they were visitations. Harvest was not a transaction. It was a partnership between human patience and the temper of the year. To the north, Etruscan influence drifted like a faint pattern on the edge of the wind. To the east, Sabine customs, stories, and habits touched the region in ways difficult to map but easy to feel. This early Italy was not one world, but many worlds lying near each other, trading words, gestures, rituals, tools, and warnings. A person might marry across a boundary, borrow a practice from a neighbor, adopt a small household custom that had once belonged to another people. The land allowed such mingling because the land itself was made of gradual transitions. hill to hollow, field to grove, spring to river, dusk to dark. At night, the stars above Latium appeared with unusual fullness, unobstructed by walls or lamps or crowded roofs. Shepherds lying awake near their flocks could read weather in the sky, but they could also feel a more difficult thing, something not exactly thought and not exactly believed, a sense that the world was inhabited not only by visible creatures, but by presence, the spirit of a hearth, the care of a spring, the temperament of a grove, the favor or displeasure of powers who did not need temples to exist. Before formal altars rose in stone, reverence already lived in posture, in pause, in a hand briefly lifted before drinking from clear water. The Tiber wound through all of this like a long memory. It gathered mountain runoffs, marsh smells, fallen leaves, silt, fish, broken reeds, and fragments of sky. It passed grazing grounds and little settlements. It reflected dawn, noon, and evening without preference. If you stood on one of the higher slopes and watched the river at a distance, it seemed less like a force than like a sentence the earth had been speaking for centuries. There were caves in the hills where shepherds sheltered from storms. There were small clearings where travelers rested and shared bread before moving on. There were ridges from which one could look out and imagine safety and height, and valleys that felt hidden enough to protect a family through hard months. The famous 7 hills were not famous yet. They were simply separate rises with separate textures, one broad and welcoming, another sharper and more watchful, another curved like a sleeping bag beneath grass and scrub. Nothing announced them. No sign stood there to tell anyone what the future would make of them. This is important, perhaps even soothing, because it means the greatness to come is not visible yet in any overwhelming way. The land has not been dressed for legend. It is ordinary in the richest sense of the word, real, weathered, useful, full of bird tracks, root systems, damp soil, and the slow labor by which people keep one another alive. If the story remained here forever, it would still be enough. Dawn, field, flock, bread, smoke, river, the old completeness of a modest world. And still, beneath that completeness, there is expectancy. Not excitement, not alarm. Something softer, as though the hills themselves are listening for footsteps not yet present, as though the river, moving under first light, already knows it will one day carry a name greater than those who now kneel beside it with clay jars in hand. For generations, life will continue like this. Children will be born under simple roofs. Elders will point to weather lines in the clouds. Women will grind grain and watch the fire. Men will mend tools and follow the sheep along familiar routes. Dogs will bark at distant movement in the dark. Birds will rise from reeds at dawn. Nothing in these tasks is small. They are the true measure of time. They are the true measure of time. Slow bed on which even legend must lie if it wishes to endure. And because the land is so patient, the story can move forward without haste. We do not need to rush toward kings. We can let the wide world narrow by degrees, from all these hills and paths and hearths. From all this undramatic continuity, a single ridge settlement now comes gently into view. Alba Longa, a place where inheritance, fear, and destiny will begin to braid together. Alba Longa rested along the Alban Ridge like a thought held carefully above a lake. It was not a huge city, not in the way later imagination would enlarge ancient beginnings, but it possessed age, continuity, and the kind of dignity that comes from being remembered as an ancestor. Roman tradition would one day trace its line back through Ascanius, son of Aeneas, toward fallen Troy itself. And whether the story was history, belief, or a weaving of both, it gave Alba Longa a strange glow. This was a place where exile had supposedly become settlement, where loss had hardened into lineage, and where kings ruled not only through power, but through the weight of remembered origins. The hills around it were thick with woodland in some places, and gently open in others. Vine rows, grain fields, and olive growth marked the more useful ground. In clear weather, the surface of the nearby lake gathered the sky so faithfully that it seemed less like water than a second opening above the earth. Small temples stood in quiet dignity, receiving grain, oil, wine, and whispered petition. Seasonal festivals gave shape to the year. People measured time by harvest, by lambing, by the return of heat, by the smell of crushed leaves after the first rains. Among the rulers of Alba Longa was a king named Proca, remembered in the old line as capable, steady, and acceptable to both household and court. He had 2 sons. Numitor, the elder, belonged by custom to succession. He is often imagined as calm, where others were restless. A man inclined toward continuity, not because he lacked strength, but because he understood that power lasts longest when it does not need to display itself at every turn. His younger brother, Amulius, possessed a different nature. Quick-minded, watchful, and inwardly hungry, he lived too near the thought of being overshadowed. Such tensions do not always begin in open conflict. Often they begin in comparison. One brother is praised for steadiness. The other learns to hear that praise as a subtraction from himself. One seems naturally fitted to rule. The other develops an intimate relationship with waiting, with resentment, with the private rehearsing of alternate futures. If the household around them noticed the difference, it may have seemed minor at first. One of those ordinary imbalances that families carry for years without collapse. But some imbalances deepen in silence. When Proca died, the expected order should have continued through Numitor. Instead, fear moved first. Amulius took the throne, however it happened in exact detail. Whether by persuasion, pressure, alliances, or force, the result was the same. Rightful succession was broken, and with it, the calm continuity on which Alba Longa had rested. Numitor was displaced, not publicly annihilated perhaps, but stripped of the secure place that had once awaited him. A line was interrupted. A household was reorganized around the anxiety of being challenged. Yet, usurpation never feels fully complete to the one who commits it. Having taken what should not have been his, Amulius could not rest inside possession. The throne brought not peace, but vigilance. He knew that a stolen crown remains in conversation with those who ought to wear it. A deposed elder brother still exists, so do nephews and grandchildren, so do those in the city who remember the order that once seemed natural. Fear, once invited in as an ally, does not leave after success. It stays. It sits beside the bed. It turns every possible future into a threat. Numitor had a daughter, Rhea Silvia, in another, kinder pattern of events. She might have grown into a life of marriage, motherhood, and the ordinary dignities available to a woman of noble birth. Under Amulius, her life became strategy. He placed her among the Vestal virgins, tying her to the service of Vesta and thereby to chastity. It was a decision wearing the clothing of piety while serving the machinery of control. If Rhea Silvia bore no children, then Numitor's line would weaken and perhaps disappear. If it disappeared, Amulius might finally sleep. The house of the Vestals, with its sacred flame and its regulated calm, provided a perfect surface for this design. All looked lawful, all seemed holy. The city could tell itself that the king had not acted cruelly, only devoutly. This is another old pattern in human affairs. Power prefers to disguise fear as duty whenever it can. Still, beneath the appearance of order, something had changed in Alba Longa. The ridge settlement remained beautiful. The lake still mirrored the morning. The people still worked, bargained, prayed, and slept. But a quiet wrongness had entered the foundation. The rightful line had been bent aside. A young woman's future had been narrowed for political convenience. The throne was held by hands that could not relax upon it. Nothing outward needed to look broken for the atmosphere to become subtly strained. If you had walked the streets at dawn, you might not have seen anything alarming. Women would still sweep thresholds, servants would carry water, men would discuss fieldwork and livestock, smoke would rise from cooking fires. Yet, among households closer to the memory of the royal line, perhaps there would have been lowered voices, pauses before certain names, glances that said more than speech aloud. People learn quickly how to live inside rearranged power. They become careful, they store opinions behind the face. They wait to see which direction history chooses next. And history, for the moment, seems to move not through public events, but through one enclosed life. Rhea Silvia, placed beside sacred fire, so that a dynasty might be cut short, becomes the quiet center toward which the whole old legend now leans. The rich city may think it has solved the problem of inheritance, but destiny rarely agrees to be solved. More often, it slips through the smallest opening left unattended, and begins there to grow. Rhea Silvia's life unfolded inside a pattern she had not chosen, though over time she learned the shape of it so well that it could almost pass for peace. Before sunrise, while much of Alba still slept in blue darkness, she rose with the other Vestals and walked through cool halls where lamplight moved gently over stone. Their service centered on the flame of Vesta, guardian of hearth continuity, domestic order, and the sacred thread binding household to city. The flame had to be watched, fed, and protected. Water had to be drawn. Ritual gestures had to be remembered exactly. Offerings had to be handled with care. Silence in such a place was not emptiness. It was discipline made audible. There was comfort in rhythm, and Rhea Silvia felt it. However unwilling the beginning, routine can soften the edges of captivity. She knew the weight of pitchers in her hands, the slight tremor of fire before it steadied, the coolness of dawn air crossing a courtyard, the sound of sandals against polished floor. She knew how smoke rose in narrow lines when the chamber was still. She knew which hour of the day brought the gentlest light across the altar, and which evening sounds from the distant city meant that another ordinary day had settled safely toward night. Yet comfort was not the same as consent. The life had been assigned to her under the authority of a king who feared her bloodline. Every prayer she spoke, every ceremonial act she performed, existed within a frame built by another person's ambition. This produced a sorrow that did not always feel like pain. Sometimes it felt more like an unanswered question living under the ribs. Is this holiness or control? Is this stillness or erasure? If one becomes graceful within a prison, has it become less of a prison? The other priestesses may have offered companionship. Shared duty often creates a tender economy of gestures. A vessel passed at the right moment, a look of recognition across the flame, a word spoken softly at day's end. Perhaps they did not ask too much, sensing that in some lives the safest kindness is not interrogation, but present. And perhaps Rhea Silvia, for all her quiet bearing, remained partly inaccessible even to them, keeping some inner chamber reserved for what had been taken from her. Outside the sanctuary, Alba Longa continued its measured life. Inside, the sacred fire burned on. The old religion gave meaning to the motions of each day. And meaning can be a balm even when circumstances are unjust. Rhea Silvia might kneel, lift, tend, and recite with a sincerity that was real, because the divine did not become false, simply because a king had acted falsely. This is one of the more tender complexities in old stories. A life can be constrained and genuine at the same time. A woman can be wronged and still capable of reverence. Ritual can both soothe and confine. So the days passed. Dawn, flame, water, prayer, midday quiet under pale stone. Evening ember light, moon above the courtyard, the city breathing at a distance, her body moving through duty, her mind perhaps wandering farther than duty allowed. To the lake, to childhood rooms, to the father-like figure of her grandfather's house before it was overshadowed by fear. to futures that no longer had a place to land. Then, as old legend tells it, something changed in the stillness. Roman tradition says that Mars, god of war, came to her, and that from this visitation, the children who would found Rome were conceived. To later ears, the story can sound many ways at once. It can sound divine, symbolic, political, poetic, or all of these braided together. For those who preserved it, the meaning mattered at least as much as the event. Rome's founders did not belong only to a harmed mortal line, but also to a larger order of force, courage, and fate. They were not merely accidental children, they were marked. For Rhea Silvia herself, however we imagine the mystery, the change would first have been human. A shift in inward knowing, a body no longer aligned with its old pattern, a private realization expanding day by day into visible truth. If she felt fear, it would have been natural. If she felt awe, that too, to carry a child under ordinary circumstances alters a woman's relation to time. To carry children in a life vowed against maternity and arranged precisely to prevent heirs from existing would have made each day feel suspended between concealment and revelation. Pregnancy slowly resists secrecy. The body speaks its own language, and sooner or later, others hear it. Murmurs would have stirred in the house of the Vestals. Faces would have changed. Eyes would have lowered and lifted again. Some may have felt scandal, some pity, some bewildered reverence. The sacred order had been interrupted, yet the interruption also carried an atmosphere too grave, too uncanny, to fit easily inside judgment. When the news reached Amulius, it awakened exactly what his earlier design had tried to bury. Fear came back larger than before. It no longer whispered from possibility. It stood before him. In fact, if the daughter of Numitor had conceived, then the line he meant to extinguish had not ended. It had gone underground and returned. That is the strange weakness of control. It can manipulate conditions, but it cannot command meaning. It can move bodies, assign roles, close doors, and watch corridors, yet it remains helpless before the deeper momentum by which certain stories insist on happening. Rhea Silvia was confined more closely. The city that once used sacred walls to contain her now turned those walls into a second form of prison. But her inner relation to time must have changed again. Whatever punishment hovered ahead, she was no longer living only within imposed stillness. She was carrying movement. She was carrying future. Somewhere under the fear, there may even have been a small and difficult peace. The peace of knowing that what had been denied to her line was alive again, and not as a rumor, but as heartbeat. The night the twins were born did not begin like the birth of a city. It began like any other tense and watchful night in a house where too many people understood that something irreversible was close. Outside, the hills lay under a pale spread of stars. Air moved lightly through leaves and along the ridge. Somewhere far below, water held moonlight in broken lines. Inside, however, time narrowed. Rooms that had once carried ritual calm now carried waiting. Servants moved carefully. Voices lowered themselves to near silence. Even those who knew little of dynastic danger could feel that the life about to arrive was entering a hostile arrangement of power. Rhea Silvia had reached the end of concealment and the end of endurance. Whatever fear had accompanied the months before now had to make room for the immediate and unarguable labor of birth. Pain has its own authority. It gathers the mind, breaks the hours apart, reduces the world's wide complications to breath, pressure, effort, and the simple animal fact of bringing life across a threshold. For a while there are no politics, only waves, no throne, only the body doing what bodies have always done in dark rooms, while other people wait and listen beyond the door. When the children came, they came not as symbols, not at first, but as infants. Warm, loud, vulnerable, impossibly small, 2 lives where Amulius had intended none. 2 sons, if you pause there, before the legend arranges itself around them. The tenderness is almost unbearable. A mother, who has been denied a future is given all at once, a double future and very little hope of keeping it. She can hold them, count fingers, feel their heat, learn the rhythm of their cries, and know in the same moment that power is already moving against them. She named them Romulus and Remus. The names seem enormous to us because history has brightened them. But in that room, they would have sounded like any names spoken softly over newborns, intimate and immediate. A mother leaning close, a voice used only for the child who hears it. Whatever hopes she whispered into them were likely small and human before they were historical. Live, stay warm, be spared, be held. Amulius, confronted with the reality he dreaded, chose the path of cowardly distance. He did not want the stain of direct bloodshed upon himself, yet he wanted the threat removed. Such rulers often prefer for death to arrive through arrangement rather than through their own hand. It allows them to imagine themselves less cruel than they are. Orders were given. The infants were to be taken away and abandoned. The river, swollen by season, would serve as executioner. And chance would do what the king wished not to witness. There is a particular horror in stories where the innocent are delivered to the landscape as though the world itself might complete what human fear began. And yet, there is also a strange softness to this one, because the landscape does not obey the frightened man. Before that refusal comes, though, there is the leaving. The servants who carried the infants out into the night may have felt anything from obedience to pity to numbness. Perhaps they avoided looking too long at the children. Perhaps one of them did look, and remembered later the shape of a tiny hand moving in moonlight. The wooden container into which the babies were placed was not a grand ark, only some practical vessel, enough to float if the water remained kind. Reeds brushed against it. The edges of the floodplain gleamed faintly. Mud held the smell of recent overflow and rooted life. Rhea Silvia, separated from them, could do nothing but imagine. That helpless imagining may have been the cruelest part, not knowing whether the water would be fast or slow, whether the infants would cry, whether the night would be cold, whether any mercy existed beyond the reach of the man who feared them. Once again, her life narrowed to waiting, but this waiting was sharper, followed by the knowledge that the next chapter of the story would be lived, if at all, beyond her arms. The river had spread beyond its ordinary limits, and in the dim light, the world around it must have looked uncertain, half land and half water. Yet uncertainty is not always destruction. The trough or cradle carrying the twins did not rush immediately toward oblivion. It drifted. It hesitated. It caught and released along the slow edges of the flooded bank. The Tiber, which in another mood might have been dangerous, moved that night with a strange and deliberate gentleness. And so the children passed out of human control. This is the moment when the story becomes impossible to read only as politic. Up to now, fear and strategy have shaped events. A crown is stolen. A woman is confined. Infants are removed. But once the river takes hold, another order enters. Call it chance, providence, fate, the sympathy of the natural world, or the old human refusal to believe that innocence goes unguarded forever. Whatever word one chooses, the feeling is the same. The children are no longer held by the intentions of a frightened king. Somewhere near the base of a hill, among roots and reeds, the cradle will come to rest. But before it settles, the night must lengthen a little. The water must continue its low speech. The stars must remain above the floodplain. The babies, exhausted by birth and motion and cold air, must sleep in small intervals between crying. It is good to imagine them not only in peril, but also in this strange moving cradle, carried by darkness that does not mean them harm, because that is the reveal hidden inside the fear. The world that was meant to erase them is already carrying them toward shelter. The river did not take them. It is one of the most comforting facts in the old legend, and worth lingering over. Water, which so often represents danger to abandoned children in myth, behaves here almost like a guardian with broad and patient hands. The current moves the small vessel away from the immediate reach of the city, yet refuses to drag it into destruction. It guides rather than consumes. It carries, then settles. It protects through motion, and then through rest. By the time the cradle catches among the roots of a wild fig tree, the night's fear has already begun to loosen. Mud, reed, root, and shallow water form a kind of cradle around the cradle. The air is cooler now, touched by the long hours before dawn. Insects make small hidden sounds. The river continues its low, indifferent music, but now it seems less like indifference and more like assurance. The children are here. They are no longer adrift. They have arrived, though no human hand arranged the destination. Imagine the scene slowly, because safety in sleep stories is often made of precise and gentle details. The wood resting against the fig roots, the damp smell of earth, the pale shape of the moon caught on pooled water in the grass, the slight stirring of cloth as the infants move. Nothing grand, nothing ceremonial, just the modest perfection of survival reaching shore. This is a good moment to breathe again and feel the stories soften around you. The threat from Alba Longa has not vanished from the larger world, but it has lost direct contact with the children. Between fear and innocence, the river has placed distance. Between ambition and vulnerability, the land itself has intervened. Perhaps this is why the Tiber remains such an important emotional home for the tale. Before Rome has laws or walls, it has rescue. Before it has kingship, it has mercy. Before it has memory, it has being carried. And because the cradle is still now, because the children are held by root and bank in darkness, instead of exposed to open current, another form of care can approach. The night is not empty, after all. It is inhabited. It is listening, somewhere near, among shadow and tall grass. Warm breath and watching eyes are already drawing close. If you return for a moment to the riverbank we made at the beginning, you can feel why this part of the story matters so much. It is the first full return to safety after a passage through control, confinement, and fear. The reeds still brush one another in the dark. The soft ground still waits. The water still makes room. All the old assurances are here again. Only now, they are no longer abstract. They have done something. They have kept life alive. So let the scene stay quiet a little longer. Let the fig tree spread its rooted steadiness above the little resting place. Let the bank hold firm. Let the current pass by without hunger. The babies need nothing from the night, except this patience, and the night, for once, is generous enough to give it. Dawn is still some distance away, but already, the darkness has changed its nature. It is no longer a danger pressing inward. It is simply a cover under which rescue can arrive unseen. From the edges of the night, the she-wolf enters the story. No image from the founding legend of Rome has lingered more powerfully than this one, and it is easy to understand why. A creature usually associated with danger approaches helpless children and becomes instead their first guardian. Her body is made for wilderness, strength, hunger, and survival. Yet in this scene, she is remembered for warmth. Moonlight catches along her back, her ears lift, her nose tests the air. She circles the resting cradle with a caution that is not menace, but attention. Old stories are generous in the way they allow symbol and event to coexist. Some have imagined an actual wolf, driven by instinct into a tenderness almost miraculous. Others have seen in the word lupa a suggestion of a human woman, nurse, or caretaker, later transformed by memory into a more mythic figure. For a sleep story, it is not necessary to force a decision. The beauty lies in the doubleness. The twins are protected by something both wild and maternal, something outside the fragile systems of kings and courts. whether furred or human or half-remembered into both at once. The first shelter after the river comes from a being untroubled by dynastic fear. The she-wolf lowers herself near them. Her breath is warm. Her flank curves around the infants, turning her own body into a living wall against the cold. If they cry, she does not recoil. If they stir, she remains. The image carries its own kind of sleep magic because it combines opposites without strain. Sharp teeth and gentleness, wilderness and nurture, night and safety. It says, in essence, that the world is larger than human cruelty and capable of answering it in forms no frightened ruler could predict. Perhaps dawn has only just begun to silver the horizon when another figure enters the scene, a shepherd named Faustulus. Shepherds belong naturally to such stories because their lives already place them at the edges between domestic life and open land. They know animal tracks, weather moods, hidden paths, and the small disturbances that signal something unusual in grass or riverbank. Faustulus, moving through his ordinary morning route, sees the cradle near the fig roots and the strange guardian beside it. The moment asks for wonder, not panic. The old tale does not preserve him as a hero confronting danger, but as a man able to recognize that the world has placed something extraordinary before him. The she-wolf does not attack. He does not turn away. In that mutual pause, wild care begins to pass gently into human care. When he lifts the children, the story shifts from miracle into daily responsibility. This is always an important movement. Spectacular rescue alone cannot raise a child. After wonder must come milk, shelter, washing, sleep, and the ordinary repetition through which life is sustained. Faustulus carries the twins home to his wife, Acea Laurentia, whose role in the legend deserves as much tenderness as the she-wolf's. If the wolf gives the children mythic beginning, Acea Laurentia gives them household continuance. She makes room for them not in symbol, but in routine. And routine, in the lives of children, is one of the deepest forms of love. Their home is humble, smoke darkens beams, tools hang where they can be reached quickly. The sounds of sheep and dogs arrive from just outside. Meals are plain and sufficient. The rhythm of the day is set by dawn, weather, and flock. Yet, this simplicity is exactly what the children need. They enter not a palace arranged by fear, but a dwelling arranged by use. Things exist where they are needed. Fire warms because warmth is necessary. Bread is shared because mouths must be fed. Sleep is taken when tiredness comes. Such homes do not always preserve grand names, but they preserve life, and that is the more ancient dignity. Acea Laurentia feeds them, wraps them, rocks them, and likely learns their small differences long before history does. One child settles more quickly, one startles sooner, one clutches cloth with more insistence, one sleeps with a lighter breath. She would know the sound of each cry. She would know how much sun to keep from their faces, how much blanket to pull higher in a chill wind, when fever should worry her, and when it would pass. Great legends often pass too quickly over women who perform this work, but no founder survives infancy without them. The softness of a hand on a child's back is as foundational as any future wall. Outside the house, the hills continue their patient instruction. Lambs are born, dogs bark at night sounds. Spring gives way to heat, heat to harvest, harvest to cold, cold again to spring. The children grow inside the long breathing of the pastoral year. They are held first by the she-wolf's body, then by shepherd care, then by the larger constancy of land and season. Each layer matters, each says, in its own way, you may remain. And because this middle portion of the story is meant to soothe as much as to move forward, it is worth staying close to the textures of that life. Think of wool drying near the fire after rain. Think of sandals left by the doorway with dust still on them. Think of a wooden bowl, rough at the edge, filled with warm milk. Think of two boys asleep while night insects hum outside and a dog shifts once in its dreaming. Think of morning light, entering slowly, and finding them safe again. The fame of Rome lies very far ahead from here. No Senate, no roads, no standards, no marble. Only 2 children who should have died and did not, breathing in a shepherd's house, while a woman who did not bear them nonetheless keeps waking to check whether they are warm enough. That is a strong enough center for any story. If the twins retained some invisible memory of the she-wolf, it would not be memory in words. More likely, it would be a disposition, a native closeness to open land, an instinctive ease among rough places, a bodily understanding that shelter can come from what appears fierce. This too shapes them. They are not merely rescued from danger, they are formed by the manner of their rescue. So when later generations look back and see destiny in these beginnings, they are not entirely wrong. But destiny here is not a trumpet blast, it is the patient layering of protection. River, root, wolf, shepherd, hearth, each takes its turn. Each keeps the boys moving quietly toward a future none of them can yet imagine. The house grows accustomed to their presence. Their names become ordinary within its walls, spoken over meals, over mended clothes, over evening weariness. The extraordinary becomes daily, and daily life works its calm alchemy once more. What was legend at the river becomes childhood at the hearth. Romulus and Remus grew not in secrecy exactly, but in a kind of soft obscurity, which is different and better for children. A secret is tense. It listens over its shoulder. Obscurity is simpler. It lets the day proceed. In the shepherd world, the twins were boys among weather, animals, chores, and other growing bodies. The horizon was made of ridges, tree lines, and changing cloud. Their lessons came less from instruction than from repetition. Walk this path, keep that lamb from straying, watch the sky over the western rise. Listen for the difference between wind in reeds and something moving through them. Bring wood before dusk, close the gate properly. Notice, this kind of upbringing makes the mind attentive without making it restless. There is always enough to do, but rarely anything theatrical. Morning opens, work begins, noon warms the stones, evening gathers everyone back toward fire and food. Over years, such days become a deep schooling in patience. The boys learn how far sound travels in cold air, how quickly a stream changes after rain, how to read a sheep's agitation, how long twilight lasts in one season compared with another. These are not royal arts, yet they are the arts of remaining alive in the real world. They run over the hills with the loose confidence of children who know the ground well. They scramble up slopes, leap gullies, follow game traces, and stand on high points to look out over the Tiber Valley, with eyes not yet trained to see destiny there. Their bodies harden, their lungs deepen, their balance improves on rough tracks and stones. They become strong not in the polished way of trained warriors, but in the more organic way of boys lifted by work, weather, and open space. Sometimes, when the day grows tired and gold, they bring the flocks down in long, slow lines, dust rising around the animal's leg. Sometimes one boy lags behind because he has stopped to watch light moving on water, or because a bird circling above has held his whole attention. Sometimes they quarrel as brothers do, from closeness rather than hatred, and just as quickly turn toward the same task again. It is important that their childhood contain ordinary things. Without ordinary things, tragedy later has no true weight, and greatness later has no human base. Faustulus teaches by example more than speech. A man who lives with flocks learns economy of words because the land itself supplies so much company. Yet what he knows passes into the boys nonetheless. How to endure long distances, how to move calmly around frightened animals, when to spend strength and when to save it, when a stranger on the road should be greeted and when quietly watched, when anger is useless, when it may be needed. These are lessons that seem small when given, but broad when lived. Aca Larentia offers another education, less visible but just as deep. She gives them belonging, She anchors the return at day's end. However far they wander, there is a meal, a threshold, a fire, and a familiar arrangement of shelter awaiting them. Perhaps she scolds, perhaps she laughs at their roughness, perhaps she tends bruises with the practical tenderness of those who cannot prevent boys from being boys, but can make them feel that hurt is survivable. Such gestures become the emotional grammar of safety. Later, even among conflict and decision, a person shaped by them carries an inner knowledge of home. The seasons write themselves into the twins year by year. In spring the earth softens, lambing demands attention, and streams run fuller. In summer, the heat pushes labor into earlier hours and turns grasses pale. In autumn the air sharpens, and the sky seems to widen. In winter the hills are stripped and more honest, every footstep clear, every smoke trail visible from farther away. To grow up in such cycles is to learn that the world is always changing and always returning, a lesson as useful to the soul as to the body. Other boys and young men in the region notice them. Courage has a way of showing even when no one announces it. The twins are quick, capable, and able to take the lead in rough circumstances without appearing to seek leadership for its own sake. This too belongs to their rural formation, in a landscape where danger can come from weather, terrain, or animal panic. Authority is often earned by steadiness rather than display. Romulus and Remus begin to carry that steadiness. Still, the middle of their life remains beautifully undramatic for a time, and there is rest in dwelling there. Imagine them lying on sun-warmed ground after work is done, one talking idly, the other half listening, both watching clouds sheer apart above the hills. Imagine the smell of crushed thyme beneath a hand. Imagine dogs asleep in shade. Imagine water drawn cool from a spring and shared between them without thought. This is the sort of substance from which deep sleep stories are made. Not only events, but texture. Not only destiny, but afternoons. The unknown truth of their birth sits nearby like a folded garment no one has opened yet. There may be hints, a sense that the boys do not quite belong to obscurity as fully as others do. A look from Faustulus kept a second too long, a silence after a question, an impression among neighbors that these brothers were born under unusual favor. But childhood does not always need explanations. It needs room, and because it has room, childhood performs one of its oldest mercies. It delays the weight of the world. Before they know crowns, or stolen lines, or frightened kings, the twins know wind, sheep, bark, fire, and one another. They know how the river sounds in flood and in drought. They know which hill gives the broadest evening view. They know where to stand when dawn first begins to touch the lower mist. This knowledge may seem humble, but it will follow them into everything that comes next. For now, it is enough that they are growing, enough that the hills have accepted their footsteps, enough that each hard day ends in shelter, enough that the story, after its earlier sorrow, has found again this wide and restful plateau. As the twins moved out of childhood and into young manhood, the world around them began to answer them differently. Strength that once belonged to play became useful in conflict. Confidence that once existed only among flocks and familiar paths started to show itself before strangers. Other shepherds noticed that Romulus and Remus could settle disputes, organize effort, or move first into difficulty with a kind of ease that made following them feel natural. This did not make life grand or ceremonial all at once, but it widened its field. The hills no longer contained the whole map of their days. With widening range came contact, and with contact came friction. The countryside around Alba Longa was not a storybook landscape without rivalry. There were disputes over pasture, raids, old loyalties, and men who served or remembered powers larger than the shepherd world. In some retellings, the twins fall into conflict with herdsmen connected to the interests of Numitor and Endymius. In others, the details vary. What remains constant is the sense that their private life among the hills can no longer remain untouched by the deeper history into which they were born. One encounter becomes decisive, whether through skirmish, accusation, or an escalating quarrel. The brothers are drawn into the orbit of those who still remember the displaced royal line. Remus, in some tellings, is captured first and taken before Numitor. Even that detail carries a certain poetry, because recognition, in old legends, often comes not through triumphant self-disclosure, but through being brought, almost accidentally, into the presence of someone prepared by age and sorrow to see what others do not. Numitor by this time lives outside the full security that should once have been his. He has endured the long thinning of authority, the humiliation of watching another sit where he should have sat, the quiet ache of a line, apparently cut off. Such men often become attentive in a particular way. Lust trains the eye when the young stranger is brought before him. Numitor does not merely see a strong youth. He notices bearing. He notices a likeness perhaps impossible to explain immediately. He notices age, timing, circumstance. A thought begins to rise, dangerous because it brings hope with it. Hope in old age can be more frightening than grief, because grief is at least familiar. Hope threatens to reopen everything if Numitor begins asking questions. They would not be loud questions. They would be careful. Who raised you? Where were you found? What do those older than you say of your birth? Each answer would move the hidden garment of truth a little farther open. Faustulus, too, cannot keep silence forever. To raise a child is to develop a loyalty deeper than convenience. And loyalty eventually turns toward truth when truth is needed for survival. However the revelation unfolds in exact sequence, the broad movement is beautifully clear. The boys learn that they are not merely shepherd sons, however beloved that life has made them. They are the children of Rhea Silvia, grandsons of Numitor, heirs to a wrong not yet set right. Such knowledge changes a person in stages, not all at once. First comes shock, then reordering. Memories are revisited under new light. Why certain looks lingered, why some silences fell strangely, why one always felt slightly larger than the life already lived. Yet because the twins have grown in a strong and grounded way, the revelation does not unmoor them completely. They do not become abstractions of royalty. They remain the same bodies formed by hill and flock and routine. The shepherd life is not erased by noble blood. It becomes the strength by which noble blood can act. There is also the emotional fact of recovery. The line thought broken has returned. A grandfather receives back, in living human form, what fear once tried to drown. The image has its own quiet power. Numitor, who had lost throne and family continuity, now finds both futures breathing before him. The recognition is personal before it is political. A face, a gesture, a tone of voice. History often speaks first through these intimate recognitions before it reaches public consequence. Action follows, but it need not be narrated in a harsh or fevered way. The twins gather support. Loyal men respond. Those still troubled by Amulius's rule find in the young brothers a center around which old justice can begin to reform. Amulius, who once trusted manipulation and removal, now faces what fear always eventually creates. The return of the future it tried to prevent, now strengthened by time and hidden nurture. When the usurper falls, the story does not need to linger on violence. This is not that kind of tale. What matters is restoration. Numitor is returned to the place that should have been his. Order, though never perfect in human affairs, is brought closer to its rightful shape. The city of Alba Longa breathes differently under this corrected inheritance, as a household breathes differently once a long falsehood is finally spoken aloud and ended. For Romulus and Remus, however, restoration is not the end. It would have been easy, in another kind of story, to stop there. The wrong is corrected, the grandfather restored, identity recovered. Yet the founding legend of Rome asks for more. The twins do not simply return to a place prepared by others. They have been shaped too much by open land, by survival, by the region near the Tiber where their first true home was found. Their imagination turns back toward the river and hills that carried them. This turning matters deeply. It means they are not motivated only by revenge or inheritance. They are drawn by memory, by terrain, by the old emotional map of rescue and growth. The place that once saved them becomes the place where they now imagine building something new. Past injury may have awakened the movement, but hope directs it. And so after recognition, after restoration, after the line of blood has found its name again, the story softens rather than hardens. It leaves behind the closed rooms of dynastic fear and returns toward open ground. The twins carry their newfound identity back toward the landscape that formed them. And in that movement, destiny stops looking like punishment and begins to look like possibility. Once Numitor had been restored, the brothers stood in a rare and delicate kind of freedom. They were no longer hidden boys without names. They were no longer merely the heirs of a wrong awaiting repair. The old injury had been answered. The royal line had spoken for itself. And precisely because one chapter had settled, another could open. What shall two young men do with lives that have already passed through water, wilderness, obscurity, labor, recognition, and justice? Stay where a place has been returned to them, or turn toward the landscape that first gathered them in, and imagine a future no one else has yet built. Their thoughts returned again and again to the lower country near the Tiber, to the hills that had held their earliest rescue and their long shepherd youth. It is easy to understand this pull. Human beings are often claimed less by the place of their rank than by the place of their becoming. Alba Longa connected them to lineage. The river country connected them to themselves. There they had been carried, protected, fed, tested by weather, and trained by work. There the shape of their bodies and instincts had formed. If a city were to rise under their hands, perhaps it should rise where survival itself had once begun. So they walked the old ground with new eyes. The Palatine lifted its slope above the river with a defensible confidence. The Aventine opened more broadly, hospitable in another way, with space enough for movement and settlement. From one height, the lines of approach could be watched. From another, the life of a future community could be imagined stretching outward in ease. The differences between the hills were not trivial. Each carried a temperament, and the brothers, shaped by similar beginnings, began to love different temperaments. Romulus saw strength in enclosure, in a height that could hold, guard, define, and endure. Remus felt drawn toward openness, toward a hill whose broader character suggested movement, breadth, and a less tightly drawn boundary. Neither vision was absurd. Neither brother lacked seriousness. That is what makes the coming sadness so gentle and so real. The division grows not from one noble and one foolish mind, but from two legitimate hopes that cannot finally occupy the same center. Before disagreement grows visible, however, there is a beautiful interval of shared making. Settlers gather, not polished aristocrats only, and not people chosen for prestige, but wanderers, laborers, those between homes, those whom older arrangements did not easily keep. The brothers understand something fundamental. New cities are not born from perfection. They are born from need, courage, and the willingness to make room. People arrive with tools, animals, baskets, stories, scars, and expectations. A patch of ground is cleared. Boundaries are considered. Water access is judged. Footpaths begin to suggest where streets might someday be. This stage of the legend deserves a slow voice because it holds one of the purest forms of human hope. The moment before a settlement becomes fixed, when everything is still sketch, gesture, agreement, and imagination. You can almost hear the talk in the late light, here for storage, there for animals, a path down toward the river, a place for fire, a place for gathering, a place where children might run in safety between households. The future city is not yet stone. It is conversation made practical. Even the atmosphere around the work feels different from the closed tension of Alba Longa under Amulius. There, power tried to preserve itself by cutting off life. Here, life tries to preserve itself by multiplying room. That contrast matters. Rome, in its mythic beginning, does not arise from purity or ease, but from inclusion. The brothers open their imagined city toward those who need belonging. The gesture contains both compassion and political instinct. Yet, in a sleep story, it can be held simply as warmth. A place that gathers the misplaced. A hill that says, "You may stay." Still, as foundations of thought deepen, difference deepens too. Romulus and Remus continue to walk, point, measure, and imagine. Yet beneath the practical conversation, another question persists. Where exactly will this new home declare itself to be? Which hill will become center? Which outlook will define the first shape of the city? The brothers do not yet stand in full opposition, but the space between preference and principle has begun to narrow. When ancient people sought clarity in such matters, they often turned not first to argument, but to sign. Augury offered a way of reading the sky for divine indication. Birds rising, circling, crossing, descending. These movements could be interpreted as messages, not because the heavens were thought to speak in simple code, but because human beings long to align action with a meaning larger than themselves. For the twins, looking upward toward the flight of birds was not superstition in the modern dismissive sense. It was a way of asking whether their private desires corresponded to something rightly ordered in the world. So the hills grow quiet again, but this time the quiet is different from the peaceful obscurity of childhood. It is charged, not violently, but thoughtfully. One brother waits on the Palatine. The other keeps watch from the Aventine. The air is clear. The sky is wide enough for both hope and interpretation. Around them the gathered people also wait, knowing that the decision to come will not be merely symbolic. It will shape the life of all who have entrusted themselves to this beginning. Before the signs are read, it is worth pausing in the tenderness that still remains between them. They are brothers who survived together, grew together, learned the land together, discovered their bloodline together, and restored their grandfather together. Their disagreement rests on a ground of deep shared life. That shared life does not vanish simply because choice draws a line through it. The sorrow to come will matter precisely because the bond has been so real. And perhaps each brother, standing on his chosen hill, feels not only determination, but loneliness. Leadership often carries that loneliness even before any public role begins. To choose is to separate oneself a little from all alternatives, even cherished ones. To found is to accept that something must become fixed, which was once still fluid and shared. The birds will come, the signs will be counted, interpretations will harden, but for one last long moment, the city exists only as possibility suspended between two heights, two visions, and one brotherhood not yet broken. It is one of the softest and saddest pauses in the whole legend, and for that reason, one of the most beautiful. The signs from the birds did not settle the matter as cleanly as Hope had wished. One brother saw enough to believe heaven favored him. The other saw enough to believe the same. Perhaps the difference lay in number, perhaps in order, perhaps in the authority each gave to what he had witnessed. However the augury was remembered, its essential effect was not peace, but confirmation of division. Once each brother felt the sky had answered in his own favor, compromise grew harder. The hills were no longer merely places of preference. They had become extensions of conviction. And yet even here, the story need not grow loud. Disagreement can remain low in tone while becoming fateful. A set jaw, a repeated interpretation, a boundary marked more firmly in earth. A gathering of followers who take their cues from the mood of the one they trust. The settlement to be, still only beginning, now holds within it a tension subtle enough to miss at a distance and impossible to ignore up close. Romulus begins to mark out his line on the Palatine, the first boundary of the city he imagines. There is something deeply symbolic in that action. A wall is not merely protection, it is definition. It says this belongs together, this is held, this is ours to guard. To someone who values security, continuity, and enduring form, such a wall is an act of care. To someone who fears confinement, exclusion, or rigidity, the same wall may seem like a narrowing of what could have been more open. Remus, still unconvinced, still stung perhaps by the whole turn of decision, approaches the growing boundary. The ancient tale remembers him crossing it in a gesture of challenge or mockery, stepping over what Romulus has begun, as if to prove that a wall so easily crossed is no true wall at all. Much depends on the mood with which one imagines that step. Was it bitter? Playful gone too far? Angry? Disbelieving? Whatever it was, it carried more force than the motion itself. In a calmer world, brothers survive such gestures. In a world burdened by destiny, fatigue, pride, and too many gathered expectations, a gesture can become the place where everything converges. What happens next is one of the great sadnesses of origin myth. Remus falls, different tellings place the blow differently, assign agency differently, sharpen or soften the scene in different ways. For this telling, what matters is not the mechanics of violence, but the atmosphere of irreversible rupture. The brotherhood that survived flood, exile, obscurity, labor, and recovery cannot survive the founding intact. The city and the loss arrive together. It is tempting to dramatize the moment with noise, but the deeper truth of the story lies in hush. Remus is there, and then he is not. Breath is in him, and then absent. The hill, the half-made boundary, the waiting sky, the gathered onlookers all remain. The world does not break apart outwardly, it becomes inwardly altered. That is often how grief first appears, not as spectacle, but as changed air. For Romulus, the loss is not only personal, though it is profoundly personal. It is also interpretive. The wall has been crossed and defended at terrible cost. The city he imagines as enduring can no longer be separated from the price already attached to its beginning. Whatever certainty he felt before is darkened now by sorrow. Whatever triumph others might project onto the scene would fail to understand it. There is no clean triumph here. The listeners within the story, the first followers, must feel the change as well. A city planned as home has become, in a single moment, a place carrying memory of fracture. Yet because ancient stories often join wound and purpose instead of isolating them, the death does not end the founding. It deepens it. Rome, in its mythic root, is not born innocent of grief. It is born with grief already inside it, that makes the tale strangely human. The things that endure longest in the world are seldom built out of pure ease. They arise from mixed materials, hope and damage, vision and error, shelter and exclusion, love and rivalry. Here the mixture is concentrated into one painful image. A boundary, a brother, a crossing, and an absence that cannot be undone. And then, as always in sleep stories, the energy must begin to lower again. After the sharpness of the event comes the settling. Voices reduce, feet stop moving. The hill receives what has happened. The air grows cool toward evening. Whatever anger fed the rupture cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Sorrow enters and takes its place. Remus remains in memory, not only as the brother who died, but as the brother who imagined another shape of the city. In that sense, he is never entirely absent. He lingers in the openness Rome never quite loses, in the idea that boundaries are necessary, yet always shadowed by the ones they exclude, in the old recollection that the city might have been otherwise, and therefore must live with humility toward its own beginning. This is the gentle ruin of brotherhood, at the heart of the tale. Not thunder, not spectacle, a quiet breaking from which a future nonetheless continues to rise. After the loss, Romulus remains on the Palatine. There is no proper word for the stillness that follows such a moment. It is not peace, and yet it is quieter than conflict. It is not emptiness, and yet something central has gone out of the world. The hill remains where it has always stood. The river still bends below. Wind still moves through grass and over rough earth. But these enduring things now surround a changed life. Romulus, who had imagined a city with his brother beside him, must now imagine it alone. The decision that follows is not simple ambition, carrying on regardless. It is more solemn than that. To stop entirely would be to let grief erase not only the future, but everything that led to it: the rescue, the growth, the restoration, the gathering of people seeking home. To continue is painful. To stop is also painful. In such situations, human beings often move forward not because certainty has returned, but because responsibility has. So Romulus names the city Rome, a name that history will later wear with overwhelming scale. Though here it is still close to breath, close to one man's mouth, close to the small circle of listeners standing on rough ground, while first intentions begin to harden into reality. Names are strange things. They gather weight over time until one forgets they were ever spoken first into uncertainty. Yet every great name begins exactly so, in air, in voice, in a moment when it could still have vanished. The work of foundation proceeds. Earth is measured, boundaries are clarified, places for gathering, storage, and dwelling begin to emerge not as abstract ideas, but as practical needs translated into form. The first city is never the city in its finished imagination. It is smaller, rougher, more provisional: posts, trenches, packed ground, paths worn by repeated feet, hands carrying stone, baskets of earth lifted and emptied, rope, timber, tools, commands, a beginning visible more in labor than in grandeur. This is one of the gentler truths hidden inside famous origins. Before monument comes effort. Before architecture comes repeated lifting. Before legend becomes inheritance. Someone must decide where to put the fire, how to cut the ditch, where animals will be kept, how water will be reached safely, where sleepers will lie when rain comes. The early Romans, if we may call them that now, are not inhabitants of a glorious capital. They are builders of a settlement trying to become durable before weather, hunger, and uncertainty test it. Romulus proves capable in this practical dimension. However, later, traditions enlarge his kingship. His authority at the start must have depended partly on the simple ability to organize effort without allowing the whole fragile enterprise to dissolve. A new city asks for more than vision. It asks for sequence. First this, then that. Secure the edge, clear the interior. Place the hearths where smoke will rise well. Make room for newcomers. Keep watch. Begin again tomorrow. And newcomers do keep arriving. This may be one of the most revealing elements in the founding story. Rome opens itself. It does not wait for only the already established or the already honored. It gathers the displaced, the landless, the unanchored, the overlooked. Men without firm household ties, travelers between allegiances, those whom older structures have not comfortably contained. The openness is partly necessity, partly genius, and partly mercy. A city that begins from rescue understands something about giving refuge. This principle, more than any single wall or trench, gives the early city its peculiar moral warmth. Roman embryo is a place that says there is room here. Not infinite room, not uncomplicated room, but room enough for beginnings, for people who need another start, for lives that do not fit cleanly elsewhere. It is impossible to know how such a welcome sounded in every early ear. Yet it must have changed the feeling of the settlement immediately. A gathered people can withstand much if they believe they belong to the place they are helping to build. Romulus also begins to shape governance. Tradition credits him with forming a senate, summoning elders, drawing counsel around the emerging kingship. Whether one imagines the exact historical form or the later Roman memory of it, the point remains deeply fitting for the story. The city is not founded solely as a shelter of bodies, but as a community of deliberation. Even at the beginning, advice matters, order matters, shared structure matters. The settlement intends not merely to exist, but to endure. An early protective force is also organized, less as imperial ambition than as practical necessity. Settlements near uncertain frontiers cannot rely on goodwill alone. They need watchers, defenders, men who understand that fragile beginnings invite testing. Yet, if we keep the story aligned with its sleep-born tone, even this martial element can be held gently. Protection here is still close to the shepherd lesson. Guard the vulnerable. Hold the boundary. Keep harm at a distance if you can. The scale is larger, but the instinct is familiar all the while. The memory of Remus remains. It does not vanish behind the city's activity. If anything, the work may sharpen it. Every measured line recalls the argument over line. Every guarded edge recalls the crossing. Every gathered person reminds Romulus of the brother with whom he once imagined such gathering. Some losses sit behind the eyes, even while the hands continue their task. They do not prevent action, but they tint it. They render all accomplishment quieter than it would otherwise be. Perhaps this is why the founding of Rome in this kind of telling feels solemn rather than triumphant. It is a first breath, not a shouted claim. The city rises under mixed light. Hope is there, yes, unmistakably. So is grief. So is gratitude to the land that carried the brothers once as helpless infants. So is the strange humility that comes when one sees how much any human beginning depends upon forces outside human control. Rivers, animals, weather, strangers willing to help, women willing to feed, hills willing to shelter. If you walk, in imagination, through this first Rome, you do not yet encounter empire. You encounter smoke from new hearths, voices getting used to one another, tools set down at dusk, children already adapting to paths that did not exist weeks earlier. A meeting of elders under open sky, rough walls, not yet weathered enough to seem inevitable. A king who is still also the man who once lay in a cradle by the river. The scale is tender. That tenderness is worth preserving against everything history later piles atop it. The city breathes. That may be the most accurate way to picture it. It breathes in the morning when fires are relit and work begins. It breathes at noon when heat presses on roofs and animals stand in shade. It breathes in the evening when cooking smoke lifts and footsteps return from the outskirts. It breathes at night when watchmen listen and sleepers dream inside the lines that were only recently drawn. A city is never just stone or timber. It is a rhythm of shared vulnerability. Romulus, in being called first king, does not become remote from this vulnerability. The legend keeps him close to necessity. He knows rescue before authority. He knows loss before foundation. He knows that a line on the earth is both promise and burden. This knowledge becomes the emotional root of his kingship. Whatever sternness he later carries, whatever institution he begins, the founding memory remains personal. Rome is not for him an abstract project. It is the continuation of a life once spared. And because the story is winding toward rest rather than closure, the city need not harden completely in our minds. We do not need to see armies, conquest, or distant centuries. We need only this first breathing place on the hill, this gathered settlement above the river, this name newly spoken, this rough beginning holding within itself all that might one day grow beyond measure. The night comes down over the Palatine as it came long ago, over the unnamed hills before any city existed. Stars appear, the Tiber moves in silver dark below, from the new dwellings rise faint sounds of settled life. A dog barks once and is quiet. Somewhere an ember shifts in a hearth. Somewhere a child, knowing nothing yet of future glory, turns in sleep. Rome has begun, not with fanfare, but with endurance, not with perfection, but with room, not with innocence, but with a grief it must carry honestly. And perhaps that is why the city feels, at its birth, not like a machine of destiny, but like a human shelter under the wide old sky of Latium. And now, as the story grows quieter, the images that have carried it can return one by one. A cradle moving slowly through floodwater in the dark. A river that could have taken, but instead delivered. A she-wolf bending her warmth around two small lives. A shepherd's doorway opening at dawn. Boys running across hills before they know who they are. Two brothers standing on separate heights under the same wide sky. A city beginning as little more than a name, a boundary, a fire, and the shared need to belong somewhere. If you let those images drift beside one another, the whole legend becomes simpler and deeper at the same time. Before Rome was power, it was vulnerability. Before it was marble, it was wood and mud and soft animal breath. Before it was law, it was shelter. Before it was history, it was a few lives kept alive through the night by forms of care that did not announce themselves as greatness at all. This may be the hidden comfort inside the story, and perhaps one reason it has endured so long. We are often taught to look at the end of things and call that their meaning. We look at a city after it has risen, expanded, conquered, and filled books, and we imagine that greatness must always have belonged to it. But old legends sometimes invite a gentler wisdom. They remind us that what becomes vast usually begins small enough to be lost. A cradle can drift out of sight. A child can disappear into reeds. A hill can remain unnamed for centuries. History itself is often only survival remembered later, with more ceremony than survival ever had in the moment. So if the city of Rome lingers in your mind tonight, let it linger in its earliest form. Not yet an empire, not even yet a certainty. Let it be a low fire under an open sky. Let it be rough ground trodden into paths by tired feet. Let it be water moving below in the dark. Let it be the memory of a brother carried within the walls that rise. Let it be a place made by people who needed room and made room for others in turn. You do not have to follow the city farther than that. You do not need to accompany it into wars, speeches, triumphs, or centuries. The story is safest here, when the first breath has only just been taken and the old natural world still surrounds the settlement on every side. The reeds are nearby, the fig roots are nearby. The hills are not yet crowded by stone. The night can still reach the houses. The stars can still be seen from every threshold. And because sleep stories are kindest when they leave something gently open, the tale does not have to close in a hard line. Rome has begun, yes, but beginning is not a lid. The river is still moving. The people within the new settlement are still dreaming futures they cannot name. The hills are still keeping their old silence beneath the first sounds of a city. Somewhere in that silence, the memory of Remus remains, not as a wound demanding wakefulness, but as a soft shadow, reminding the living to be humble in what they build. Somewhere, too, the care of Acca Larentia remains. The warmth of the she-wolf remains. The mercy of the river remains. Founding does not erase them, it rests upon them. If you feel yourself drifting now, you can simply drift with the Tiber. Let it carry away the edges of the story until only a few quiet things remain. Water at night, grass bending, moonlight on a slow current, a hearth breathing softly behind a wall, a distant hill under stars. The sense that even the largest things in the world were once fragile, once hidden, once dependent on tenderness they could not repay. And perhaps there is comfort in that for your own tired mind tonight. You do not have to become anything all at once. You do not have to rise like a city by force. It is enough to be carried for a while, enough to rest among roots, enough to be warm, and still, and unfinished. So the river keeps on moving, so the river keeps on moving. Past the fig tree, past the shepherd paths, past the first rough boundary on the hill, past the sleeping houses of the newborn city. It moves under moonlight now, and under cloud, and under stars too faint to name. It moves the way breath moves when the body has finally stopped resisting rest. Slow, quiet, untroubled, always making room for what can be gently carried. And if, before sleep fully takes you, one last image should remain, let it be this: an old river in the dark, a cradle held safely at the bank, and beyond it, on a hill under the patient sky, the first small lights of Rome.